It is my pleasure to welcome to campus today Dr. Kenneth Osgood, who, as Corey said, is Associate Professor of History at Florida Atlantic University. He's also the director of the Alan B. Larkin Symposium on the American Presidency at Florida Atlantic. Dr. Osgood received his bachelor's degree at Notre Dame and went on to earn a master's and doctorate degree at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Osgood is widely regarded as one of the rising stars in the field of U.S. foreign relations history. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies at Ohio State in 2003-2004. And in this most recent academic year, he was the Mary Ball Washington Chair in American History at University College Dublin. Most recently, he was named as one of the country's top young historians by the History News Network. Dr. Osgood's research focuses on the relationship between U.S. foreign relations, propaganda, and how media and culture affect U.S. foreign policy. He's the author of a book that one reviewer called the best book to date on any aspect of U.S. Cold War propaganda, and that book is titled The Total Cold War, Eisenhower's Secret Propaganda Battle at Home and Abroad, which just this year was awarded the Herbert Hoover Prize for the best book written on topics dealing with issues during Hoover's lifetime. He's the author of numerous other publications, including an edited book and several articles. And his next research project tentatively will be an overview of the 1950s, both in terms of foreign and domestic policy and the issue of communism. His talk today is titled America's Global Battle for Hearts and Minds, the Early Cold War Reconsidered.
Thanks, Andy and Corey, for bringing me out here and making this possible. I spent a little time living in Salt Lake City, and it's great to be back, especially on such an absolutely perfect day, and it's great to be here at BYU. And my students, I don't normally begin my lectures, I'm not usually introduced with a prayer of thanks. I'm sure my students do pray when I walk in, but maybe more out of desperation than anything else. So thank you for the wonderful introduction. I'm going to talk today about the battle for hearts and minds, and it's something we hear a lot about these days in thinking about the war on terrorism. And every week, in fact, about 50 articles and blogs address the issue of public diplomacy, which is a euphemistic term that not too long ago would have been called propaganda or information or psychological warfare. Indeed, over and over again after September 11th, both President Bush and former British Prime Minister Tony Blair emphasized that the war on terror was and is, in large part, a war of ideas. And counterterrorism experts have stressed even more forcefully that the greatest danger posed by al-Qaeda as an organization is its ideology, an ideology that promotes, justifies, and encourages terrorism as a legitimate, useful, and moral tactic for those dissatisfied with the current state of the world. Now, in trying to meet this sort of ideological challenge, the Bush administration has devoted significant resources to what is now called public diplomacy. For example, it created the Office of Global Communications in the White House, which is charged with responding immediately to challenges to American image and to generally putting forth a positive impression of the United States. And if you go on their webpage, one of the things you'll see prominently displayed is a note that the President received from Condoleezza Rice informing him that Iraq had been granted sovereignty, and on it you can see his scribble, "Let freedom reign," showcasing the President's commitment to democracy in Iraq. Just last week, another public diplomacy measure implemented was on the State Department. They created a blog on its website called Dipnote, on the official U.S. Department of State blog that you can read and participate on the Department of State webpage. And you can see that the State Department sort of promoting itself as being able to communicate to the public. And here is one of the guys who will be blogging, and as he's featured prominently on the website, introducing himself and saying, "Welcome to the State Department's first ever blog. With the launch of Dipnote, we are hoping to start a dialogue with the public." And on there, the idea is that diplomats will respond in a sort of chatty and informal way to the concerns of the public about American foreign policy. And then, of course, the White House has also appointed Karen Hughes, who is a close confidant of the President's, to a new post in the State Department, the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy. And her appointment is especially significant because, by all accounts, she has the ear of the president. She has a close personal relationship with the president, and there are some signs that he is listening to her advice and crafting his words and deeds to a greater extent to try to improve the U.S. image around the world. Now, the process since September 11th of revamping America's overseas propaganda programs has been a tortured one indeed. Throughout the Cold War, there had been a large government agency devoted to global propaganda or information known as the U.S. Information Agency, or USIA. But almost as soon as the Cold War ended, the USIA was dismembered by Congress and dismantled entirely, and the information program languished throughout the 1990s. I use the terms propaganda and information and public diplomacy interchangeably, by the way. And it took the attacks of September 11th to sort of change course and lead to a revamping of the global information program. And as the American government sought to do so, it looked back to Cold War history for ideas about how to revamp its public diplomacy efforts. For 5 decades, the United States had spent many billions of dollars in global propaganda, and so the Bush administration quite reasonably thought that it could find usable lessons from that experience. Now, I personally have to imagine it faced a great challenge in looking to Cold War history for lessons about public diplomacy, in large part because until recently there had been very little historical investigation of U.S. propaganda programs. And indeed, when I first started researching what became my book on the subject, there were only a few books and articles on it. I mean, almost none. And so I was required to sort of dig through the archives and reconstruct this history. And it shows the challenges that are faced. So the historical perspective is really thin. And so what I'd like to do is just to give you a slice of that early history of American propaganda in the early Cold War in order to highlight some of the challenges that the United States faces today. And it's not so much to give you a set of lessons that we need to do today. As Andy Johns could attest, my historical predictions, my predictions for the future are terrible. And it's one of the dangers of being a historian. You're asked to forecast the future, but you spend all your time reading about the past. So what I really hope to do is really just to sort of start a dialogue about the role of propaganda in American foreign policy. Now, as I began researching Cold War propaganda, I was especially struck by how far-reaching the global battle for hearts and minds was. U.S. psychological warfare activities in the Cold War were extensive, they were usually secret, and they received sustained attention at the highest levels of the American government. And you can see here in this image, it's a picture of Laotian children gathered outside what was then cutting-edge technology, a large speaker that was accompanied a mobile movie projection unit, and they're getting ready to listen to a propaganda film shown by the American government. And in fact, if you sort of look at this image and some other ones that I'll show you in a moment, you'll get a sense of how sort of global the reach of American propaganda was in the Cold War, but also how it had to sort of bring communications technology to remote parts of the Third World in its sort of battle to win over the Third World in the Cold War competition. So, for example, here's an image of a horse and cart that are being used to carry a power generator and a film projector to remote villages in Pakistan. And the USIA operatives would go into the village, set up a portable screen, and fire up the generator and show a movie. And people would come just to see a moving picture, which was not an everyday occurrence at that time and in that place. Here you can see an image in the Philippines where workers are loading truckloads of forklift full of propaganda leaflets that are going to be distributed throughout Southeast Asia. Or here an audience gathers in San Andreas, Mexico to view an outdoor showing of a USIA film on some aspect of the Cold War theme. Or here in Brazil, a bunch of boys are gathering to watch a USIA film. And then my personal favorite image that I encountered in my research, a USIA officer is explaining a space satellite to what looks to be a very primitive group of individuals in a remote African village. And I think the contrast there in images is pretty striking. Now, as I did my research, and it's one of the things that these images indicate, is that U.S. psychological warfare programs overwhelmingly targeted audiences in allied and neutral countries. There were some efforts to foment unrest behind what we called the Iron Curtain, but the bulk of the effort focused on the free world, or our side of the Iron Curtain, as it was said. In the 1950s, the USIA operated 208 what they called information posts in 91 countries. And their job was to sell the American way of life and American foreign policy to foreigners who were increasingly skeptical about both. And American propaganda operations varied from country to country. Some emphasized anti-communist indoctrination. Others promoted free enterprise and democratic procedures. Some amounted to propaganda in support of right-wing dictatorships that were allied with the United States, and still others added up to public relations for American business. This global political warfare effort focused on tying countries to the Free World Coalition and isolating communist regimes. But American efforts to influence foreign public opinion extended way beyond mere propaganda and way beyond these sort of very obvious attempts to influence people abroad. The imperative of shaping public perceptions and attitudes affected an extraordinary range of activities relating to U.S. foreign relations, such things as trade and economic aid policy, space exploration and scientific research, atomic energy and disarmament, book publications and educational exchanges, cultural interactions, and indeed everyday life. So all of this, the broad scope of American efforts to shape foreign perceptions, compels us to rethink what we call propaganda. Propaganda has sort of a negative connotation as lies, but it should not be construed merely as lies or even merely as words, but rather as a range of communication activities and actions that are used to have an impact on public perceptions and attitudes. In addition, we also need to reconceptualize the way we think about how propaganda is disseminated. There is a sense that, to a certain extent, if justified, that propaganda abroad is okay, but that the government should stay out of the propaganda business at home. And related to that, there is an idea that we can sort of draw a line in the sand, separating American propaganda abroad from democratic dialogue at home. But in fact, the U.S. government has a very poor track record in keeping itself out of the domestic propaganda business. The line has been crossed repeatedly, and especially in wartime. During World War I and World War II, the government created vast bureaucracies charged with maintaining the fighting morale of the American population through propaganda. And after the Second World War, there was a sharp backlash against this sort of brazen attempt to manipulate public opinion. And it was so strong that when the government went to create the U.S. Information Agency and a permanent propaganda apparatus for the Cold War, the Congress mandated that that agency would not be allowed to disseminate propaganda within the United States. And so it was strictly forbidden from disseminating any kind of information within the U.S. Now, despite such legal restrictions on domestic propaganda, I discovered in my research that there was case after case when the United States expressly targeted the American public with its propaganda. But it was done in sort of a backhanded, soft-pedaled kind of way. And I'd like to give you what amounts to actually a very lighthearted example of how this works. Now, if you were an American traveling abroad in the 1950s, you might find a pamphlet like this at your local passport office. And you can see at the top there, it says, "Americans Abroad, Spokesman for the USA." And down here next to the Statue of Liberty, it says, "You too speak for America." Now inside, the pamphlet instructed travelers that as Americans abroad, they were spokesmen for the United States. And it advised travelers that they had better be prepared to explain and justify U.S. policies to people they meet. It said, "One thing you want to keep in mind," remember this is the 50s, "one thing you want to keep in mind is this. You'll probably be asked some questions that are mighty tough to answer, yet mighty important you try to answer well. Don't be surprised if the questions asked occasionally reflect current anti-American propaganda. If you can give an accurate and convincing reply, you can blunt the edge of propaganda. The pamphlet then listed some questions that the travelers might be asked, and it provided short answers for them to learn to respond to those questions. Some of the questions were, do Americans really want peace? Why does the U.S. government spend so much money for military purposes? If Americans believe in democracy, how do you explain racial discrimination in the United States? Isn't the American worker exploited by big business? Are you Americans as materialistic as some people say? All told, the pamphlet was 41 pages long, and it included 35 such questions on diverse aspects of American life, and indeed most of those questions remain the types of, sort of address the types of issues that remain salient today. But each question in any event was followed by a concise answer that the American travelers were to recite in a presumably impromptu fashion to people they encountered on their travels. For example, on the question of whether Americans were materialistic, the pamphlet gave this answer. If by being materialistic you mean that Americans want to live as well and comfortably as they can, we plead guilty. But a high standard of living is not proof of a materialistic outlook on life. Many of us are deeply concerned with the spiritual and cultural side of life. On the question of why the United States spent so much money on the military, it gave this answer. No one would be more pleased than the American people to spend less money on the military. When the danger to our security recedes, we shall gladly shift such spending to more constructive purposes. Now, if you looked at the back of this pamphlet, you'll see it explains where it comes from. And it says that this booklet was published by private citizens working on behalf of the People-to-People program. And it says we distribute it in the hope that it will help Americans traveling abroad to become better spokesmen for the USA. And then it tells you you can purchase additional copies for 10 cents each, or 10 cents each, or 5 cents, depending on the quantity. And then at the bottom, it gives you an address for the People-to-People program located in Waldwick, New Jersey. Now, the claim that this is a pamphlet produced by a private entity is at best half true. Technically, the People-to-People Corporation was private, so technically the pamphlet was paid for and distributed by a private organization. But the People-to-People Corporation itself was created and managed by officials in the U.S. Information Agency under the direction of the American President, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Moreover, the entire pamphlet was written by public relations and propaganda specialists within the government. Every question and every answer was drafted by government officials in the business of shaping public opinion, something I just sort of happened to stumble upon when I was researching in declassified documents in the archives. Now, the pamphlet reflects President Dwight Eisenhower's personal role in shaping American propaganda strategy in the 1950s. There was a time when Americans perceived Eisenhower as sort of a nice grandfatherly guy who was more interested in playing golf than in being president. But in fact, declassified documents made quite clear that Eisenhower was very much in control of American foreign policy, and he also took a very personal interest in the propaganda war. And he had a sweeping view of what constituted psychological warfare. As he said on one occasion, quote, "Psychological warfare can be anything from the singing of a beautiful hymn up to the most extraordinary kind of physical sabotage." As president, Eisenhower played an important part in shaping U.S. propaganda strategy. His predecessor, Harry Truman, in that period, American propaganda was almost embarrassingly strident. There were anti-communist polemics that were so hard-hitting in tone and style that they were not unlike the brazen exhortation we associate with Goebbels and the Nazis. And I'll give you one sort of just simple example. Here's a comic book that was distributed during the onset of the Korean War called The Korea Story. And there you can see the Red Army's tanks rolling, crushing old men and children and helpless women, and the sort of the terror being initiated from above. And this sort of very kind of obvious, heavy-handed kind of technique with blood dripping from sickles and this kind of thing was really, really common. Eisenhower thought this in-your-face approach didn't work, and he had 5 principles that he believed would make American propaganda more effective. First, he believed most propaganda should be positive. it was more important to sell the virtues of the American way of life than to harp on the vices of communism. He said pamphlets like the thing you saw there alienated people because they were so obviously attack pieces. He also believed that propaganda should be covert. He noted that people are suspicious of propaganda by foreign governments. They tend not to trust or believe it. And so Eisenhower insisted that only a small fraction of U.S. propaganda activities should be openly identified with the American government. Most materials, like the pamphlet I showed you a few moments ago, were unattributed to the government. They were distributed covertly using bribes or dummy organizations or other techniques. So the government's role was hidden. Third, Eisenhower believed that the government should use private groups to disseminate American propaganda so that the hand of government would be further concealed. Eisenhower tried to involve non-governmental organizations, civic clubs, women's groups, labor organizations, and ordinary Americans in the effort to win over public opinion. And he reasoned that international audiences would be less likely to view private groups as propagandists, and they would therefore be more receptive to the message. Fourth, Eisenhower believed that it was as important to maintain morale at home as it was to win over public opinion abroad. All of the major propaganda campaigns of the 1950s were consciously crafted to influence two audiences: world opinion and domestic opinion. And you might have suspected this when I read the questions and answers from the pamphlet. It was attempting to reach these two different audiences, the foreign audience as well as the domestic audience. One of those audiences was obvious, and the other was sort of camouflaged behind the nature of the pamphlet. The obvious audience, of course, were the foreigners who Americans encountered on their travels. If, presuming the Americans did their homework, they would be impressed by American goodwill and savvy and would come across with a better view of the United States. But the camouflaged audience were the tourists themselves. The pamphlet sought to reinforce their confidence in American foreign policy, to remind them of the positive aspects of American life, to sell the Cold War to them, and to build up their resistance to communist propaganda and so-called anti-American sentiments. Now, Eisenhower's fifth principle for propaganda strategy was the most important. He believed that propaganda should influence policy. He noted that all aspects of American foreign policy had an impact on how people perceived the United States. Therefore, all American policies should be made with world public opinion in mind. In a curious way, then, Eisenhower's belief in the power of propaganda was conditioned by an appreciation of its limits. He repeatedly said that mere words were not enough. What really mattered were deeds. So Eisenhower believed that psychological warfare could not be separated from other elements of foreign policy. And you can see this sort of most easily, most readily, if you look at Eisenhower's approach to peace and disarmament. Eisenhower was worried at the time that the United States was being branded as a warmonger, while the communists in the Soviet Union were getting credit for seeking peace. So Eisenhower used diplomatic negotiations with the Soviet Union to show the world that the United States was earnestly seeking an end to the arms race and a peaceful settlement to the Cold War. He wanted to prove to the world the peaceful intentions of the United States, and he wanted to sort of cast the Soviet Union as the villain responsible for continuing the Cold War. Now, the most dramatic example of this was Atoms for Peace, perhaps the single largest propaganda campaign ever organized by the American government. Atoms for Peace began with a very simple proposal. Eisenhower went before the United Nations and he gave a very dramatic speech in which he made a proposal for international cooperation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. He said, why don't both sides, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, take nuclear materials from their stockpiles, turn them over to an international agency, and use them for peaceful purposes, like electric power production or treating cancer or other kinds of beneficial uses. And he presented this to the world as a disarmament proposal. He said this will be a first step towards international cooperation and it'll pave the way for more concrete agreements later. But in fact, its goal was the opposite. Atoms for Peace sought to facilitate the ongoing buildup of nuclear weapons, not to arrest it. It sought to do so by making the public believe that the splitting of the atom was a gift to mankind. And the idea was this: the public would be made less fearful of atomic bombs if it could be induced to see the atom as a friend. Thus, the Eisenhower administration flooded the global media with news and information about the peaceful applications of nuclear energy. And the idea was that these positive stories would drown out stories about the destructive power of hydrogen bombs, which had just been developed, and the dangers of radioactive fallout, which was becoming increasingly well known. And so here, actually, in this image you're seeing here, you see a Pakistani man standing behind a large poster with words from Eisenhower's speech, and he's reading a pamphlet describing the Atoms for Peace program. And this was one part of the effort to promote Atoms for Peace. They sent traveling exhibits all around the world, and thousands of people thronged to see these exhibits about the atom. Now, the Eisenhower administration also extensively promoted Atoms for Peace at home. And in fact, in the popular press, there were article after article after this speech talking about the great things that atoms can do. And it even appeared in National Geographic, which ran a front page story entitled, "Man's New Servant, the Friendly Atom." And the article began by saying that when many people hear the word atom, they immediately think of the word bomb. So it was going to tell a brighter, happier story of how atomic energy was building a better world. And then it listed a wide range of peaceful applications of atomic energy, and it even noted that, quote, golf balls had been made radioactive so they could be more easily located when lost in the rough. One of the photographs that accompanied the article showed a young boy sitting with his dog, the dog was going under radiation therapy to treat a cancerous tumor, and the caption read, "Even a dog's life can be made happier through atomic energy's healing power." Now, for over 8 years in every country of the world, the United States publicized and hyped the peaceful uses of atomic energy, making Atoms for Peace arguably the largest propaganda campaign in American history. It blended propaganda with policy. It mixed words and deeds, and it was used as both a foreign and a domestic propaganda tool. Eisenhower's interest in appealing to international public opinion extended still further to the arena of cultural diplomacy. And the United States, under his watch, pushed for a crash expansion in cultural exchange activities to send American artists, entertainers, musicians, symphonies, ballets overseas to show the world that the American had a vibrant culture. Here you can see a picture of Duke Ellington going on a USIA-sponsored tour. Now, although such activities were publicly defended as programs to promote international understanding, Eisenhower saw them as propaganda forums. They would help spread positive ideas about American race relations, about American culture, about American democracy, capitalism, and ideals. And such activities were also supplemented by Eisenhower's efforts to get ordinary Americans personally involved in the spreading of international goodwill. In 1956, the Eisenhower administration launched the People-to-People program. And it was designed to encourage ordinary Americans, non-governmental organizations, and private industry to engage in public relations work on behalf of the U.S. government, on behalf of the United States. And the logic was very simple. People-to-People would encourage ordinary people to develop friendly contacts with like-minded foreigners, who would then be convinced of the basic goodness of the American people and thereby of the benevolent intentions of U.S. foreign policy. And so the basic theme of this pamphlet here, make a friend this trip for yourself, for your business, for your country, highlighted the theme of the People-to-People program. It encouraged Americans to make friends with people overseas so those people would have a better view of Americans and hopefully of the United States. Now, time and again, from Eisenhower's perspective, People-to-People served the purposes of both international propaganda, spreading positive ideas about the United States, and domestic mobilization, the mobilization of the American people. While promoting a favorable view of the United States abroad, it also gave Americans a sense of personal participation in the Cold War struggle. And indeed, time and time again, those who participated in People-to-People interpreted their activities as small but meaningful contributions to international understanding. One People-to-People program, for example, brought together pet owners in the United States with other animal lovers abroad. And the Americans who participated in the program wrote letters to other pet owners overseas. They mailed photographs of their pets, and occasionally they met up with their animal-loving friends on their travels. And the American pet owners saw themselves as doing something greater than sharing stories about animals. They were working for peace. One club member, for example, reported to a local newspaper, quote, "Dogs make good ambassadors. They are capable of hurdling the barriers of language and ideology in the quest for peace." Now, looking at these and other propaganda programs in the early Cold War calls to mind how extensive the global battle for hearts and minds was. Not only did the United States use its formidable resources to shape the development of the global information media, but the ideological battle against communism also transformed American life and culture in numerous ways. The Cold War was, to a great extent, a total conflict that exerted a profound impact on American life. Many talked about the Cold War as if it was, essentially, the same kind of conflict that World War I and World War II had been. A total conflict, an all-embracing struggle demanding the mobilization of all the nation's resources. Only because this war was not a hot war, it was a cold one, it demanded ideological and spiritual and cultural resources. Now, it is tempting to look back on how U.S. fought the Cold War and extract lessons for the war on terror. After all, most people note that we won the Cold War, so why not look back at that conflict for ideas on how to win this one? But there are many reasons to tread cautiously when it comes to the global battle for hearts and minds. For one, we know very little about how effective U.S. propaganda activities were. It is very easy to assume that because a particular campaign was really creative or bold or extensive, that it worked. But that temptation should be resisted. It is incredibly difficult to assess the effectiveness of advertising and public relations and propaganda campaigns under the best of circumstances. And it's even more difficult when looking back at the past, when evidence is shaky at best. And indeed, there's plenty of evidence to show that the effectiveness was limited. Atoms for Peace, which was held up at the time as a real model for how these things could be done, shows some short-term success, but it shows how that success could be limited. In the immediate aftermath of Eisenhower's proposal in the early part of 1954, Atoms for Peace had a profound impact on the American press, and you had all these stories appearing about how great the atom was. But those stories faded very quickly as news about the dangers of radioactive fallout and nuclear testing began to reach the public. All the benefits of Atoms for Peace vanished. In mid-1954, after a nuclear test in the Pacific Ocean sprayed a Japanese fishing boat with radioactive materials, and the fishermen of the boat came down with radioactive sickness. The boat was unfortunately named the Lucky Dragon. Now, after the crew of the Lucky Dragon came ill with radioactive poisoning before the world media, it became very difficult to talk persuasively about our friend, the atom. We also need to be watchful about the impact of the propaganda war at home. In looking at the past, we need to ask to what extent the propaganda war stifled public debate or corrupted the very democratic processes it was ostensibly designed to protect. And we should be mindful of the fact that extravagant propaganda campaigns, no matter how clever, can do more harm than good. Covert propaganda, if exposed, can provoke a terrible backlash that undermines the broader credibility of the U.S. government and the American people. And we saw this a few years ago when news came out that the Defense Department and one of its contractors in Iraq, for example, was paying Iraqi reporters to print stories that the U.S. Army wanted printed. And once that story came out, it completely undermined every message that the United States was trying to put forward. Plans that look good also can backfire terribly. So, for example, after the 1952 revolution in Egypt, when the nationalist government of Gamal Abdel Nasser came to power, the CIA gave the Egyptian government money, equipment, and training to develop the most powerful broadcasting facilities in the entire Middle East. And they hoped that the new government would be a voice against communism in the Middle East. But instead, what happened within a matter of months, really, is that Nasser turned his new formidable propaganda apparatus to work attacking American, British, and Israeli imperialism in the Middle East. and he became America's biggest rival in the region, in large part because of the power and reach of his Arab nationalist propaganda that the American government secretly helped him to create. Now, if there's a positive lesson to learn from the early Cold War, it is one Eisenhower understood well, but he and his successors followed unevenly. It is the simple point that deeds matter more than words. What we do, how we act, will have a greater impact on foreign perceptions than what we say. One need only to look at sort of the current Blackwater scandal or the recent, or the further back in time, the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, to see how true this is, that such events often can have a much greater impact on foreign perceptions than what we do. And in short, we can learn something from a secret report written for Eisenhower in 1953. Quote, "The Cold War cannot be won by words alone. What we do will be vastly more important than what we say." Thank you. Sure.
As long as people want to go till 1. So.
Okay.
I'll start.
Dr. John said I had to ask a question, so that's why I'm doing.
He said it had to be a tough one, too, so I'm shaking.
I'll try to ask you a tough one. You talked about the lack of propaganda, foreign and domestic, during the 1990s. Do you think that in order to have propaganda, whether it's effective or not, there needs to be a paradigm in the world where the United States can put up an us versus them equation, both domestically and also to our foreign allies and also neutral nations, where we can say clearly that there is another force in the world, be it the Soviet Union or now the terrorist, in order for this type of activity to be one, considered, and two, effective in any way?
I'm not sure if I exactly understand the question. Are you suggesting that there has to be an enemy in order for...
Right. Yeah, I'm suggesting, do you believe that in order for this type of activity to work, there has to exist in the world a large enough us versus them equation in order for these types of operations and activities to, one, really be considered, and two, be effective in any way? Because I think it would be fair to say that in the 1990s you didn't have a clear-cut enemy of the United States anywhere, where a U.S. president and U.S. diplomats could go out and say to other people, both domestically and foreign, that we are fighting X. We're either fighting the Soviets, we're fighting the war on terror. Do you think that that paradigm has to exist in order for these types of propaganda activities to go on?
Well, yes and no. In a sense, yes, there has to be, at least historically, Americans have been very uneasy about the idea of their government engaging in propaganda. And there's a great discomfort among Americans about that kind of activity. That's the kind of thing the totalitarian states did, the Nazis and the authoritarian regimes and Kim Jong-il's Korea and et cetera. So Americans have been only sort of willing to allow the government to sort of go into those areas when they perceive there to be a great foreign threat. So during the First World War and the Second World War, the Cold War, when they're perceived to be a great enemy, then those programs would be allowed to continue. And each time when the conflict ended, the pressure became great to collapse them and shut them down, or at least greatly scale them back. They never actually ended completely, but they were scaled back greatly. And indeed, in the 1990s, there was an active propaganda program. The major thrust of it was actually trying to promote American business abroad, but it was a much smaller thing than had existed during the Cold War. So in a sense of what American people will allow, there is an element of there has to be some kind of foreign threat. In terms of whether it worked or not, I'm not so sure that there is that having an us versus them actually helps. And that certainly in the Cold War period, oftentimes the hard-hitting anti-communist message of American propaganda alienated foreigners more often than it won them over. That a lot of people became, there are tons of reports that suggest that people became kind of sick of the sort of communist red menace language that was used during the Cold War, and that made them sort of, hey, this is too much for me, kind of thing. And so there is an element of this, certainly the president's words in the past several years that have been very much this us versus them, good versus evil. have sold well in some quarters, but in large parts of the world they're actually very off-putting for being too simplistic, and that oftentimes the more compelling message is the more positive message when it comes out. That would be my theory as far as it goes.
Brett Rushforth in the History Department. You mentioned a couple of times issues related to race. And on this final point you make about what we do matters more than what we say, I think this is particularly relevant. So, and I'm sure you've thought a lot about this, and so I'd like you just to maybe speak a little bit more to that issue. You know, that pamphlet that was in the passport office that says, you know, it had the question about race, but you didn't elaborate on that here. And then Duke Ellington going out, you know, and highlighting jazz as an American art form. But of course, this is the era of Brown versus the Board of Education and sort of the early movements, and then of course conservative reactions against the civil rights movement. So if you could just speak to that issue just a little bit. Yeah,
I mean, there are few issues that were more troublesome to the American government as it tried to wage the Cold War than the civil rights problems that were going on in the United States. You had all these incidents where foreign diplomats from newly independent African countries would come to the United States and they'd be forced to stay in segregated hotels. Washington, D.C. was segregated at that time. So you had foreign diplomats go into restaurants that wouldn't serve them. And then they would go back and tell their countries and report this to their media. And as the United States is trying to seek to get allies in these countries, it was just devastating. And then you add that to such things as the Little Rock incident, where the school in Little Rock, Arkansas, resisted desegregation, and Eisenhower eventually, after about this thing went on for about a year, sent in American troops to escort 9 black children to school. And it was a huge, huge international incident that just drowned out the stories about the United States throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, places where race was a key issue. It played up in the press, and it was the story about life in the United States, was this effort of a few African-American children to try to desegregate a school. And so the Eisenhower administration tried to deal with it, but it was an area where Eisenhower did not live up to his words and deeds rhetoric. He resisted it, and I pointed out in the book that there's a contrast in his thinking, that he believed, you know, we can shape how people view the atom. We can make people think good things about the atom bomb. But he did not believe that he could change people's minds about race relations. And he repeatedly said, well, they're going to think that, and so we shouldn't do anything about it. And so he tended to soft pedal that issue. And it was only when Little Rock became just an insurmountable international crisis that he eventually said, okay, we've got to do something about it. We've got to send in American troops. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that his decision for doing so was in large part driven by the fact that the U.S. was getting pummeled in the overseas media on the issue of segregation and civil rights.
I was just curious, when they are trying to work with this people-to-people group in the cultural diplomacy by sending, you know, our musicians and artists and stuff, did they ever worry that that would get to the point that, was it fairly government-controlled, like who got sent and who was talking to who? Did they ever worry that that would get to the point where just anybody would be going out and talking and start sending messages that the government didn't want sent?
There was an uneasy tension. Whenever you have a situation where the government's working with private groups that have their own agendas, there's an uneasy tension going on there. And that was very much the case with the artists and entertainers who went overseas. You know, I imagine that most of them went overseas because they got their trip paid for, they got to play before international audiences, you know, they got a great gig. You know, it's why I accept grants from the government to spend a year in Ireland, for example. You know, it's a great, you know, it's a fun, exciting opportunity. The government tried to exert some control over who went and who was selected, and they tried to deny those kind of resources or other things to those who they knew would have an adverse message. So Paul Robeson, who was a big singer at the time, he had his passport repeatedly revoked for saying things negative about the United States and for traveling to Moscow. Josephine Baker was another African-American entertainer who had her passport revoked and her visa denied and things like that. And so there are these efforts to try to control what people could say where. But on the whole, the programs that sent American entertainers and artists abroad, there was some effort to try to determine who was selected, but after that there wasn't too much effort to heavy-handedly manage it. I think they got sort of little pep talks and things of that nature, but they were also encouraged to be kind of open and honest. So on race relations, you would often have these very effective moments where African-American entertainers would talk very candidly about race relations in the South, and their candor would actually help improve the American image. So like there was a big exhibit in Brussels on the Brussels World Fair that was called Unfinished Work. And it actually was an exhibit that showcased all the problems, or several key problems in American life, and talked about how the United States was working to address them. And one of them was race relations. And it sat there, it showed shanty towns and segregation and slavery, but then it said, look at all the progress African Americans have made. And many of the people who visited the exhibit walked away and said, you know what, that's pretty impressive. You know, the communists are sitting there painting this perfect rosy picture of what their life is like, and yet here the Americans are, and they're willing to talk about their problems. That's pretty cool. And so there was a lot of people responded very positively to that approach. And then there were also cases where things just backfired. For example, a symphony traveling overseas had to cancel its show when half of the group accused the other half of the group of being communist, which sort of completely played to the stereotype of all Americans are hysterical anti-communists.
There's a question at the very back.
Yeah, there's a few.
Green shirt. Morgan, you've had it for a while.
Hi, my name is Andrew Scabland, and I'm a history major. I'll ask this really quickly. One difference I see from today as well as the Cold War is, I guess, just the introducing of the internet and how that is able to show a lot of the inconsistencies in American rhetoric and propaganda as far as our policy, and how you think in some ways that affects the propaganda of today, and if it even makes it almost impossible to create.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we're at such an information-saturated age, and there's so many different sources of information. One reason the United States had a little bit more leverage in the 50s was because these communication industries in a lot of the developing countries were just emerging. And so the United States would often be able to get materials on the air or in print simply by virtue of the fact that they were free. So, you know, like in Japan in the 50s, one tactic would involve going to a radio show, and they'd have like 3 free programs to offer the local radio producer. 2 of them would be sort of propaganda talk shows featuring Americans talking about problems, and the third would be a jazz program. And the Japanese radio producer wanted to play the jazz program, but he kind of felt he had to take the other stuff too because it all came along with it. And that's one way that they sort of were able to get media on the air, was that in this very, very young and emerging market where there was not this sort of flood of media, that they had this kind of leverage. Now it's much more difficult. It would be interesting to kind of track this dip note program that the State Department's running. That's their effort to try to reach out into that community. But to see how it really works, are people actually going to it? What are they going to it for? Why? Who are these guys who are posting on there? Are they actually going to? I find it hard to imagine that a hardcore Islamist in Pakistan is going to go to the State Department website, committed to jihad, and all of a sudden say to himself, well, you know what, this guy looks really nice on there, and he says these nice things. Maybe I won't go blow myself up. Or so, you know, it's just sort of this kind of absurd kind of, no, it shows how difficult the problem is. So I think it's exponentially more difficult now with the media in there. There's so many different sources of news and information that it becomes much more difficult to control the message.
Take one more question. We lose our quorum.
Dan White, history major. I was just wondering, it seems that the propaganda was spread mostly by the executive department, specifically the president. How much would you say, if any, did Congress play a role in promoting this propaganda, and how effective was it when both sides were working together?
Well, you're absolutely right that much of the sort of effort to shape public opinion, sort of conscious effort to shape public opinion, was run by the executive. You had examples of individual congressmen being used as sort of emissaries. Adam Clayton Powell, for example, was an African American who was often traveled overseas to difficult spots, you know, tried to sort of shore up public opinion and also to highlight the race problem at home because he was working on that agenda in the Congress. But generally, Congress is a much less organized, less systematic body, and it's more focused with making laws than it is on projecting an image to the world. So most of the activity was centered in the executive branch, and the president himself is the chief spokesperson of the country. I mean, whoever is in the White House is the one, sort of the chief propagandist of the country. He's the one whose words and messages are going to have the greatest impact abroad. And Eisenhower himself was very conscious of that effect. And so there's one reason why it's such an interesting period to study, because he's one that really had an idea of himself as a world leader, not just an American leader. And he had an obligation to sort of reach out to others as well as sort of reach his domestic constituencies. Congress, when it had an impact, probably had a negative impact, at least in the early 50s. McCarthy did Senator McCarthy did untold damage to American image abroad as he and his aides went traveling through Europe and burning books at U.S. libraries. I mean, there was the United States setting up libraries overseas to give access to American writing and ideas and sort of, freedom and democracy and all this stuff. And then he'd show up with his aides and pull out a bunch of books written by some left-wingers and burn them out in the streets, and it just did not help. So oftentimes those kind of actions can have a greater impact, in part because media coverage always goes to where the controversy is. And so when you have a controversy, that becomes the story. And so oftentimes the biggest anti-communists, the biggest bigots, the freaks would be the story rather than some of the more positive aspects.